Hello and welcome to the Capitol Report on NTD Television. I'm Steve Lance. Amid the second largest bank failure in history, President Biden defending the U.S. banking system and telling Americans to rest assured. But some investors are saying they're concerned about how the government's actions could impact the market in the long run. NTD's Iris Tao brings us more from the White House.
After the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank last week, President Biden tries to assure Americans that he can have confidence in the U.S. banking system amid federal response.
Americans can have confidence that the banking system is safe. Your deposits will be there when you need them.
The Monday speech comes after bank regulators announced on Sunday that the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation would fully cover deposits at both failed banks. And the money will come from Wall Street and large financial corporations instead of taxpayers.
No losses will be borne by the taxpayers. Instead, the money will come from the fees that banks pay into the Deposit Insurance Fund.
But investors in the banks will not get the same protection, as Biden says they knowingly took the risk.
That's how capitalism works.
The downward spiral of FVB began last Wednesday when it surprised investors with the news that it needed over $2 billion to shore up its balance sheet. And in just a matter of days, SVB collapsed as worried depositors rushed to take their money out, contributing to the second biggest banking failure in U.S. history. And while some lawmakers praised Biden for the sweeping action,
he took very strong action. Action that in many ways is extraordinary but absolutely necessary.
Shark Tank Judge Kevin O'Leary says Biden's move effectively nationalized the private banking system, which will have a profound impact on investors.
Or according to what the president's going to say, you have zero risk, and that has consequences. There's no such thing as a free lunch, and this is going to be very expensive for shareholders of banks long term. I would never put my money into a bank stock ever again.
Meanwhile, SVB's collapse is also shaking up expectations about the next rate hike by the Federal Reserve. The Fed has been rapidly increasing interest rates to try to tame inflation. But the latest bank failures and the stress in the banking system overall are making banks like Goldman Sachs tell their clients that they're no longer expecting another rate hike next week. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
Congressman Mike Flood sits on the House Financial Services Committee, and he joins us to assess the fallout from the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank. Congressman Mike Flood, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So, Congressman, I have to ask you, with the Silicon Valley Bank here, what do you think were some of the primary factors that have led to the sudden collapse?
Well, just some of the information that I've come aware of, the massive growth that this bank saw in the last 2.5 years. This bank went from being a $50 billion bank to a $220 billion bank. In just the last year, it's doubled in the total assets. So we're talking about a financial institution that's had a meteoric rise. It begs the question, where were the regulators? What were they doing? This by no means is a community bank. This bank was a specialty bank that had massive growth, and obviously there's a lot of questions to be asked as to why this happened. I think it's a good thing that we're going to get answers to that, but the Federal Reserve and the FDIC have made their decisions, and what I want to reassure people is that your community banks, that the banks that our banking system in America is safe. It's safe to keep your money in, and it is a system that has withstood the test of time, and it will do so going forward. We have to sort out what this specific bank was doing.
Congressman, this issue has immediately become political. You have the president now vowing new bank rules, his administration referring to the previous administration, loosening those. Is this the answer, do you think, and do you see it actually making headway in the House if they go this route?
Well, this is such a Washington thing to do. Throw the baby out with the bathwater. What we have to do is we have to find out what was happening at Silicon Valley Bank. We need to find out what the regulators were doing, what the depositors were doing. If you're holding that much money in a bank, 90% of these deposits exceeded $250,000. I want to know what the regulators were doing. Were they doing their job? Every single problem that we have in America cannot be fixed by passing another law. We have to make sure that we understand there's a big difference between a bank like this and the banks that we use every single day across the United States, the banks that I rely on here in Nebraska that we know are safe. What I fear is that this will lead to another round of regulation for regulation's sake. Let's find out what failed here before we start pledging all sorts of new bank regulations. Let's find out who didn't do their job and why this bank was growing so fast and what was contributing to it before we start to put the thumb down of the federal government on all the folks that are just trying to earn a living and relying on banks that are financially and fiscally sound.
It's an excellent point, Congressman. You know, a lot of times when we see anything happen in life, there's always tends to be a knee-jerk reaction with a scapegoat, and it typically doesn't wind up being the best course of action. So to your point, what do you think will ultimately be learned? What can be learned from this? And second question is, how big of a risk is it by setting a precedent of bailing out some of these banks in one way or another rather than allowing a natural flow of correction?
Well, what I think is important to set the record straight on, the shareholders that own the bank stock of Silicon Valley Bank, their bank stock is worthless now. They will lose everything. And quite frankly, they should. The money that's being used by the Federal Reserve is basically an insurance policy that banks all over America pay into. And so what we're doing with that, what the Federal Reserve is doing with that, they're taking that insurance policy that is paid for by the banks and they're making those depositors whole. Now, what will happen to replenish that fund? They will assess each bank in America an assessment to replenish the fund. But it begs the question, what has changed here? Do we now send the message that every single bank that has a failure, we're not going to set ourselves at $250,000. We're going to go up to make people absolutely whole. People have to understand that there's a limit for $250 for a reason. Now, I'm not second guessing what the Federal Reserve did here. I'm not second guessing what the FDIC did. I think that we are on a better path because of the actions that were taken over the weekend. But I think we got here because we had an issue with regulators. We had bank leadership that made decisions that put themselves in a terrible spot. And we had depositors who apparently were ignoring, to some extent, the FDIC insurance limits. That said, now's the time to figure out what's happening here. And you know what else happens? When Washington overreacts, the people that get punished are the entrepreneurs in a small town somewhere in middle America that can't get a loan because there's too much regulation. We need to unlock American innovation. We need to make sure regulators are doing their job. And ultimately, we need to make sure that this never happens again.
Congressman Mike Flood, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for having me.
The Biden administration is striking a different tone on fossil fuel policy. Today, the White House announcing it's green lighting a scaled-back version of the controversial oil drilling project in Alaska. Here's NTD's Melina Wisecup with more.
Soon, there will be more oil flowing from Alaska's North Slope, an oil drilling project that's been in limbo since it was leased decades ago, now on track to produce around 180,000 barrels a day.
What does this approval for the Willow Project actually mean for Alaska and our nation's energy supply?
Well, it's a huge day for Alaska, Melina. What it does is it gives Alaska another gigantic oil field to tap and produce oil and gas for the country. And this project is on federal lands. It is large. It can be done environmentally responsibly. Everybody that works on the North Slope knows that Alaska has the highest environmental standards. I can't say it was fully expected, but it's welcomed by the vast majority of the people here in Alaska.
The project quickly garnered praise from both sides of the aisle, both Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski and newly elected Democrat Congresswoman Mary Peltola saying the project will generate revenues and create jobs. And some say the project is good news for the neighboring state of California.
But a lot of that oil ends up getting refined in California. What those Alaska barrels do is they replace Saudi oil that is coming via ship into California.
In recent weeks, the Biden administration striking a different tone on oil and gas.
So we're going to need oil for at least another decade.
I would like to think that the president got a wake-up call.
Biden's teetering on a narrow line as he still tries to keep his grip on his progressive base. The Willow Project is scaled back from 5 drilling pads to just 3. Still, climate activists slam it as a lack of climate leadership and accuse Biden of handing over an intact ecosystem to ConocoPhillips. Messaging like this emerging as popular on social media, notably on the Chinese-owned app TikTok. Alaska Senator Dan Sullivan last week telling reporters,
has had over 300 million views relating to stopping this project. Maybe that's the Chinese Communist Party trying to influence young Americans.
Climate groups will likely launch court challenges to stop the project. But if all stays on track, oil could be flowing down the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in 3 to 4 years. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.